This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week, we are very fortunate to have with us an expert on political change and democratic activism, especially among young people in Latin America. We are joined by a new friend who I had the opportunity to work with on a large international Model UN conference. This is Dr. Andrés González. He's a political scientist based in Quito, Ecuador. He's speaking to us from Quito today. He obtained his PhD in political science and international relations from one of my favorite universities in Europe, where I also had the opportunity to spend some time, Ludwigs-Maximilians-Universität in Munich. And he has taught in several universities and high schools in Germany and Ecuador. He's absolutely fluent in English, German, and Spanish, as well as other languages, I'm sure, putting me to shame with my broken German and broken French and other things. He's currently president and academic director of a really interesting, outstanding institution. I encourage people to look up their website. It is called Politicum. And we will also have the website on our website. They're an independent education corporation focused on citizenship and political education, exactly what we're interested in every week on our podcast, for students of all levels and multi-languages and multiple cultural backgrounds. Andrés is also the author of a book, Governance for the 21st Century, The Fight Against Corruption in Latin America. Andrés, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Jeremi and Zach. I'm very pleased to join you from the middle of the world.
From the middle of the world, yes. Zachary, what is the title of your poem today?
In the Aftermath.
In the Aftermath. Okay, well, let's hear it.
In the aftermath, they saw the flags turn into dollar signs and battle songs fold into jingles and cigarette ads. Not hope, but a cynical greed. Not hate, but a shadowy sort of apathy. And now they are seeing their salt flats become factories, their oceans overflowing, their rivers purple, on good days brown. In the backwoods dreaming, maybe in a slum or favela singing, perhaps sitting on a bus in a cold rain, whistling in the aftermath of a hurricane. There is something recaptured, reborn, a true hope, a real hate, no longer just a blank stare. The poet escaping the dictator on horseback looks back at his pursuers and sees in them the weight of history. Not insurmountable, but difficult. Not impersonal, but difficult. Now, in the halls hallowed, hollowed out like pumpkins as if by cannonball, they have dared to see the sort of future no one else can. It is seeping out of the mountains. It makes its way through the hills, jungles, and cities like a silent fog. Not sinister, but disconcerting.
That's a very moving poem, Zachary, and I love the
Wow.
reference.
Yeah, congratulations on that. Very full of sentiment.
Thank you.
What is your poem about, Zachary?
Well, my poem is really about trying to understand the moment that young people face in Latin America today. Obviously, it's not something I'm very closely acquainted with, but I tried to connect it sort of to my experience as a young person and to this sense of history that is both comforting and hopeful, but also deeply suffocating and problematic.
Yes. Andrés, I think that's such a good place to start our conversation. How have you seen activism among young people, those who you now teach and mentor? How is it different from when you were a young man, not that long ago?
No, yes, actually a long time ago. But I would say there are certain parallels and there are certain things that are different. I think one of the major changes so far is that social media and technology have become the fueling element of protest. I remember that the Prime Minister of the UK when he referred to the events in Egypt when they overthrew Hosni Mubarak. He called it not a coup d'etat, but a coup de text, because the people started to get together via text messages. They started to organize via text messages. And I thought of that concept being very interesting because I see that the change that we have right now is that young people are using the technology to get informed, but also to organize. That is a double-edged sword because, of course, you want, in a democracy, of course, political participation. You want people to join political institutions, political organizations, or to create something. But the organization of protest happens without any control whatsoever from any state institution, meaning that tomorrow there could be, protest or strike, and no one from the government will know until it happens.
Right. Right.
And so I think that's one thing that has changed. Now, the parallel that I want to make for when I was a teenager is that young people are not necessarily familiar and friendly with the term politics.
Yes.
And let me tell you my experience with political science. I wanted to be a journalist when I started college or university in Munich. And then I had to take political science as a minor. It was an obligatory minor. And I thought, that's not going to work because I am not interested in politics. I hate politics because at that time here in Ecuador, politics were very violent in terms of, the classical scene of politicians punching each other's faces in Congress, right? And I thought, this is not going to work. I went to my first lecture on political science and I fell in love. And I said, what is this world? And then, ever since then, my love affair with political science and with political issues and bringing them to young people has been ongoing. It's like a long-lasting marriage. But the problem is that we see a disenchantment of young people because they always feel betrayed. And that has not changed in the last, let's say, 30 years here in Latin America, at least. They feel betrayed by the political establishment, not only because of promises not being fulfilled, but rather by not allowing access to young people to express themselves, to participate, and to generate a change.
How do you think the past year or so of pandemic and democratic chaos, if you will, has changed how young people are involved in politics?
I think the pandemic triggered a couple of things that were latent. They were hiding under the surface, and then all of a sudden they exploded. And take a look at what happened in Colombia last year. Young people took the streets in the main cities, Bogota, Medellin, Cali, and they were protesting because of a lot of things that were issues before the pandemic, but got a lot worse during the pandemic. The economic inequality, for example. I don't see Latin America as necessarily a poor region. It's an unequal region. It's unequally distributed. And the problem here was that those problems became intolerable, unbearable, unmanageable for young people who, didn't have a job, who did not have a perspective. What's going to happen after the pandemic if I studied, tourism, and there's no more tourism in the future because the pandemic closed everything down? That triggered the young people, to go out on the street and say to the government, we need something new, or we need something effective for that matter, because the inequality, and especially in Latin America, became wider as the pandemic struck. Lots of people lost their jobs. Lots of people who had very good jobs, lost them. I take only the example of pilots who flew the whole time. They were grounded and they had to fly once a month. A pilot who flew normally, almost every day. And they had to turn and see what alternatives there were. And there weren't many alternatives. And so they went out to the street and they protested because of a disenchantment with governments who did not act as quickly as they should have, especially after or during the pandemic.
Traditionally, Andres, at least from the United States point of view, when we've studied social activism and protest movements in Latin America for the last half century, there's been an emphasis on the role of a Marxist tradition and the influence of Fidel Castro, for example, throughout the region. Obviously, we're in a different moment now. Mm-hmm. Is there a guiding ideology? Is there some common framework that these protesters are appealing to?
I don't think there are real contents, political contents, like, for example, in the 1960s, 1970s, the big figures of the left in Latin America turn out to be more right than those who claim to be from the right side. And I give you the example of our former president, Rafael Correa, who claimed to be a leftist, but his government was a government of companies, of private companies, of dealings with, international investors. And so the big new left in Latin America could have been a parody of Saturday Night Live. How? Because it was neither new nor it was left, And you probably, Jeremy, maybe Zach doesn't know who I refer to, but you probably remember the sketches in the 1990s about those terms,
Yes, of course.
It was quite Mike Myers,
Yes,
and he made these parodies. And it was amazing because they proclaimed at the early 2000s the new socialism in Latin America, and it wasn't any of that. You take a look at all the countries. I think politics are cyclical. There's left and right the whole time, But I think there are no more of these figures of the left, not even Maduro in Venezuela, not even the ousted Morales in Bolivia. There is no real guidance rather than say, let's go against the government. But going against the government doesn't have this impetus of an ideology. It's more of a pragmatism.
And do you think that's good or bad?
I think that is bad because it's a matter of overthrowing whoever is in power. And there have been here in Ecuador 2 years ago, pre-pandemic, well, actually 3 years ago, 2019, end of 2019, October, there was a big uprising because the government, who claimed actually to be more left than right, cut down the subsidies or cut out the subsidies of fossil fuels. And people went out to the street. Many organizations went out to the street, the good organizations and the bad organizations. And they forced the President Lenin Moreno, to back off. They forced President Moreno to back off, and he declared the decree or the law that he proclaimed as not valid. He took it back. Why did he take it back? Because these people went out and literally burned down the city. And when I say burn down the city, you can Google it, and there's, Ecuador Protest 2019. People went out to the street to burn down government buildings. And it was incredible. We've never seen something like that. But there was an amalgamation of organizations. So young people went out to protest, yes. But also extreme groups that had nothing to do with the protests who wanted to just oust the government. Then the indigenous movement took the streets. And that is, in Latin American countries, a very sensitive issue because in the history of Latin America, these groups have always traditionally been neglected by politics, by history, by society. And so they took the streets. And it was incredible. On the one hand, you could say, yes, it was the right thing to do to take the streets and fight for, justice, equality. But the amount of violence that was generated, it was confused. They blamed several groups, amongst them the indigenous people, for the burning down of Quito, and they marched on or through neighborhoods who had nothing, absolutely never seen something like that. And what do I mean by this? The protests are always in the center where the government building is, okay? Mm-hmm. So all the protests were in the historical center of Quito, but this time they marched everywhere. They came very close to where I live, where there's nothing, no government buildings, it's a residential area, and they marched. And that was something that we've never seen before. The airport closed for several days. I was stuck in Lima for 3 days trying to come back here. And that, for me, it was a bad thing that so much violence was generated. And that, of course, made the protest turn into something bad rather than into something good. And until now, nobody knows who started the violence. So I think young people become disenchanted because of that, because they take it out on the streets, but then there's, the clashes with the police. And then afterwards, nothing happens. So the product of the protests in Ecuador, in Chile, in Colombia, even in Venezuela, have not given the changes that people need. Or even that you mentioned Cuba. There was a massive movement a couple of months ago. Nothing has happened. So the young people see that disenchantment, and that is the big problem. That is why the continuous violence happens in several countries. It's not only us, it's everywhere.
You're certainly right that there has been a lot of violence involved in these political movements, but and a lot of that violence, too, has come from governments. Why is it that governments have failed to respond effectively with effective political messages or other tools to address some of these concerns?
I think the problem of all the governments that face violent protest is, I would say, the progressive use of force. Because at first you don't say anything, you let them protest, and as long as they're peaceful, it's fine. But then it only takes one stone to fall on a helmet of a cop, and then the whole thing explodes. Now the problem in Colombia, in Chile, in Ecuador, in other countries, is that there is a lack of education and training in the police forces on how to act, on how to, make their move without engaging in violence. And that's one of the biggest problems of our police force here. It's young men and women who have no training and they have no equipment, and they have to face a mob of people with stones and sticks and everything. How do you do that? And so I think that there were parallels in many countries of Latin America where the police forces say, hey, don't blame us. We're here actually to protect you, actually. But then it was impossible to resist or impossible not to handle when you have such an angry mob. And it's always something that I tell my students all the time at Politicum is, imagine you are the president and people are burning down your government buildings. Would you use violence immediately? Would you wait? Would you not? What would you do? And it's incredibly striking to me that many young people say, if I was sitting on the chair of the president, I would send everyone to turn down the strikes or whatever. And that worries me because I don't believe that violence is the solution. But it worries me because that triggers some attitudes of young people towards disagreements that is very dangerous. Because if one of these kids turns out to be the president in 20 years and he's not going to doubt to send police forces to protesters, then we have a problem.
Right. Is there a need for more of an ideologically coherent philosophy behind the demands for reform? What you've described are reactions to mistreatment, reactions to deprivation, all of which sound reasonable and positions that many of us can sympathize with. Obviously, one wouldn't sympathize with the use of violence, but is the absence of an alternative philosophy, is that a real challenge today for groups that are trying to change their governments and change the way people operate?
Absolutely. I think there is a lack of knowledge about politics. There's a lack of interest about politics. In my classes, I take students who don't know what their rights are, where their rights are embedded, why is it important to vote, why is it important to have information before you vote. And so people just protest for the sake of protesting. And people have this, once again, sense of immediateness. So what they want is not the right to win or the left to win. They want a better minimum wage. They want jobs. They want fuels not to go higher. So there's a pragmatism right there. There's no, I don't see, and I don't think that many of the people that protest, especially the young people, are ideologically or philosophically guided. They're guided because out of need. They're guided because they want an immediate change that will better their lives. Now, the Chilean case presents a very interesting case because now we have a leftist leader, a very young one. He's still in his 30s, and many people see the hope. And here's the thing, what I think it's very, very, very difficult. The government in Chile is now full of the people who went out on the streets, right? So those people who were the leaders of youth organizations are now taking places in ministries, etc., etc., etc. The big question here, how are they going to react to protesters? They're now the government, right? So they are now, in the eyes of many people, they're now the bad guys. And they turn, from the street to the palace. How is that going to go? So Chile, for me, is a country in which we have to be very observant because of the nature of the government and because the new president has announced that he's, complete leftist, etc., etc. But at the end, I believe countries in Latin America are extremely pragmatic. Best example right now, our president, Guillermo Lasso, went to China. And he went to China to negotiate the terms of the huge amount of loans that we have with China. He doesn't care about any philosophical or any political matters. Of course, he did not mention touchy issues such as human rights or something, because that's a no-go when you negotiate with such a big country. That's a topic that they don't want to touch, and that's fine. But you see, it's pragmatism. Our president is seen as a right-wing conservative president, and he didn't bother to go to China to negotiate. Why? Because we sold, unfortunately, our oil reserves too early to the Chinese, and now we have to negotiate.
Wow. So in your analysis, then, what we're confronted with are a series of problems of governance, which in some ways are classic political science problems with a long history. And we have almost just a cyclical action and reaction occurring in our societies. How do we break out of that?
I think the breaking out of that has to do with the economy. I believe that whoever government in the region manages to find a way to improve the economic situation of the people, to get rid of the inequality, to give young people a chance to thrive, to give young people the chance for a job, not only a job flipping burgers, but a promising job. Saying you're going to flip burgers for a year, but then things are going to change for you. You're going to become, I don't know, store manager or whatever. That is what will bring a change. And I'm not much of an economist because I'm a political scientist, but I have seen that the empty promises of many leaders are leading to this cycle of violence and to the cycle of disenchantment. So, for example, our government here in Ecuador is saying we are the government of togetherness, meaning in Spanish, el gobierno del encuentro, okay, where people meet and get together. But right now, in some areas, the government is doing completely the opposite. So they're calling it the government of not togetherness, saying of the desencuentro in Spanish. And there's many voices who say, yeah, well, he's doing on a couple of fronts, he's doing the right thing. And I think people have to also support the government. But in other areas, people don't see that change. People don't see the immediate changes. And we, the middle class, a couple of weeks ago, had to face with higher taxes because it's the only way for the government to, manage the very delicate economic situation. So my answer is definitely that the economy has to be managed by people who know, by people who, despite any economic ideologies, do the right thing for the countries.
Of course, one of the challenges in Latin America, though, Andres, historically has been that the technocrats who run the economy are often out of touch with the people, and something I know you've written quite a bit on, problems of corruption, yes?
Absolutely. There is no development without tackling the issue of corruption. So, in a country where the pizza arrives before the police, and you can actually not necessarily spend your money in hiring a lawyer where you can buy a judge, then you have a big problem. Then you have a very, very big problem. And I'm not taking that phrase to my own authorship. It was, I think he was a Nigerian colleague of mine who said in the African system, you don't necessarily employ lawyers. You actually get your money together to buy judges. And the problem in Latin America is the same because corruption is one of the biggest impediments for development. There was a time here in Ecuador where out of every dollar that was received in foreign aid, 60 cents went to corruption and 40 cents only came to the right hands. So then you have the problem of how to deal with that. Because I always say in my class, corruption is like terrorism, is like stupidity. Those three problems you cannot erase from the world. And you cannot necessarily tackle it down properly under one solution. So I tell my students, what do you do with stupid people? And then they say, well, you have to define who is stupid, right? And any social scientist will tell you, well, that's a matter of perspective. So corruption is the same. And then you say, all right, is there a definition for corruption? You can say the abuse of public power for private gain. That's the most used definition. But then if you are a social scientist, then you take a look at the definition and you see it's flawed because it's not always the abuse of public power. It's also the abuse of private power. And then you get into these discussions, and every government, at least here in Ecuador and in other countries as well in the region, have promised every time they say, we will take down on the issue of corruption. We will take those down who accept bribes. We will take measures, structural measures to tackle it down. But it's a very difficult problem to tackle down because of the different ramifications it has. It was back in the 1970s where there's a whole bunch of literature of economists, especially, who say, what's the problem with corruption? Everything runs, and it's the grease that oils the machine.
Right. Yes.
And the problem is that it's not, right? So there's a whole generation of political scientists who claim, no, that's not okay. But then the issue of corruption as a impediment for development is what has the region and all of the countries. And I think all of the countries in the region have the same challenges when it comes to corruption. And take a look at the corruption perceptions index from Transparency International.
Yes.
And then you'll see all the Latin American countries in the lesser good half because of the mismanagement of governments.
Do you think that young activists today understand this problem, and is there a chance they will be less susceptible to the corruption?
I think it's a matter of information. I think if young people were to engage in dialogues, in real dialogues, about the issues of countries, you would create, you would educate, you would generate a very solid group of people, a new generation that will see these things clear. But if someone rather reads about what happened during the Super Bowl in the halftime show than reading why is the president, being accused of X, Y in X country, then we do have a problem. And I like, for example, stars and famous people who motivate young people to engage in causes. And I think one of the recent examples has been Leonardo DiCaprio with his whole environmentalism thing and claiming that the Galapagos is something that we should take care about. And people follow that. So I think the problem of young people is that they don't get informed, that they don't have the spaces to talk about these things, because then we have a bigger problem. The schools, the high schools, don't allow these spaces because they lack the time and the resources. They rather teach chemistry, they rather teach math, which are fundamental, of course. But we used to have a space in our curriculum where you used to talk about national issues and even global issues. And not all the schools have that anymore. So what I think is young people need the spaces to speak, to give their thoughts. That's one of the reasons, actually, what we created Politicum, to give those students the tools to debate, to understand, and even to read the paper. I have a student who sends me, you would expect students to send you questions. He sends me articles from the newspaper in Germany that he finds interesting. And that's, for me, that's a win. Because he reads the newspaper in German and says, oh, I find this one interesting. I find this one interesting. What do you think about this one? And that is what we need to generate. If we're going to have a true activism, then it has to be informed. It has to be based on the interest of young people.
That's so well said. And I think it's universal. Zachary, what do you think? I mean, is this vision of a more informed public sphere that Andrés is articulating, and he's drawing on a large political science literature, of course, on this? Is an informed public sphere something you see developing among young people? And do you see it having the kinds of international dimensions that Andrés is talking about with, I know you also read German, Zachary, and reading other languages and seeing the news from other points of view. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think that it's becoming much more international, and I think that we are seeing a renewed interest in pragmatic local issues and problem solving that has real local impacts, but is done in a global intellectual community. And I think that that's really been crystallized by COVID, because in a world of pandemic, you can't simply look to the solutions at home. You have to look abroad as well, but you also have to come up with solutions and policies that actually solve the problems and keep people out of the hospitals and keep people fed. And I think that as much as COVID has brought suffering to so many, it's also opened the door for these kinds of opportunities and these kinds of dialogues about these issues.
I think that's a very informed and optimistic point of view. Andrés, I was going to ask you to react to that, please.
My reaction to that is actually a story that happened a month ago in our class, Politicum for Universities, that I teach for German students. I teach from the middle of the world, and they are all in Europe. And wow. We made one exercise, and Zach, you will find this interesting. I told them, find out the news about the crisis in Ukraine. Okay? Very easy task. But I said to them, from a local newspaper. One of the students was in Turkey. The other one was in Italy. The other one was in the Netherlands. Only one was in Germany. The other one was in Spain. They went to the local news, and we saw 5 different versions of the Ukraine conflict. And it was amazing. It was incredible. We all did it over Zoom. And my exercise aimed at saying COVID has vanished the borders of information, has vanished once again the borders of how we can reach people. I teach a class with people that are in 5 different countries, and I don't even have to leave my desk. And that's something that did not happen before the pandemic. And the sad thing about it is that we did have the technology for that. We just didn't use it.
Right.
So if you wanted to have an international class, you would actually have to host them in some place, and now you don't have to do it. So we took a look at 5 different versions of the Ukraine conflict, and it was incredible. So I believe that some of the things that you said are evolving, and we should not stop carrying out the message internationally. We should not see COVID as this pandemic that only brought bad things. I believe, and I think, Jeremy, when we opened the Model UN 2 weeks ago, you saw people from different places. You saw kids who stood up until, or were up until midnight in Europe, right? And I think the pandemic has given us the virtuality that for many people is a burden. I understand. But for some that are becoming, not the few, but the many, it's a tool of inclusion. It's a tool of saying, hey, I can teach you. Of course. Where are you? I am in, I don't know, Mongolia. And do you have internet? Yes. Okay, then I can teach you. Of course, my limitation is when they don't have internet. Yes, absolutely. That is a, great point. But now I see a lot of people, Zach, I don't know, in your age, if people are like that, but my teenagers here, whenever they come to I don't know, reunion or a house, they don't ask where the bathroom is. They ask you for the Wi-Fi password.
It's
so amazing,
It's so true.
And back in the day where Jeremy and I used to go to reunions or parties, you used to say, can you tell me where the bathroom is, or can I help you with something? The kids are very specific, and they say, I need the password because I need to be connected. And I think the idea of COVID being a point zero on mankind, so to speak, in terms of we all needed to start from scratch, is a valid point, but it's a valid point for inclusion. And I want to finish this part of the inclusion, not only the kids that are far away, but also kids that might be next door, but have some issue being in front of an audience, being in front of their peers. I've had a lot of students at Politicum who suffered from bullying, for example, and who did not, were not able to talk about politics because they said, oh, there goes the nerd again. But now they're in their home, in a safe place, and they don't have any censorship whatsoever by teachers or peers or whatever. They're there and they're safe. And that's the beauty of the virtuality. And when it comes to teaching politics, I think it's very amazing that I can teach a class to wherever wants it in the world, and I don't have to leave my desk.
Yes. I think you've given us a tour de force and a visionary description, Andrés, of how the challenges of our world also open up certain opportunities for young activists, not just reacting to the challenges of their moment, but also articulating and building connections that didn't exist before. And I love your vision of a transnational dialogue among young people, really articulating alternatives to the moment that we live in today. I hope all of our listeners, I know all of our listeners, will take some inspiration from that. And the very fact that we could have you on this podcast from Ecuador, describing your experiences on multiple continents from your desk is
exactly.
It's so empowering. It was unthinkable, Andrés, for you and I to do this even a decade ago, and there's such possibility in that. So I thank you for your optimism, your international point of view, and your commitment, I think, to what's most important for a vibrant public sphere. It's really
thank you. And I believe that, if you're going to use virtuality to educate, it's up to the teachers and educators to make it work.
Yes.
I think yes, of course, the problems of not being live. But as you said, how would we have had met if not through these virtuality? And now, if we stay in touch, things are going to be easier for you to join, for example, one of our classes, or for me to come back to the podcast or to your classroom without the burden of traveling, which makes it even more environmentally friendly. And that's also something that I saw in the young people that I interviewed. And I said, why do you want to do this? And they said, I don't have to use fuel to do anything, to move around.
Precisely.
And that is the future. I think that is the future.
I think you're absolutely right. And it has been a real pleasure to speak with you. I know we will remain friends and collaborators, and I look forward to continuing to learn from you and to see your impact on the ground in Ecuador and elsewhere. Thank you again, Andrés.
Thank you. Thank you to both, to Jeremi and to Zach, for this wonderful idea. I didn't know about the poem, and the very first thing that came to my mind was U2's song Sunday Bloody Sunday, and a protest song, and I thought of the poem as the beginning of the podcast as a great idea. So keep it up, and we'll hear each other in the next episode.
That is correct. Zachary, thank you. And did you have U2's Sunday Bloody Sunday in mind?
Unfortunately not, but it's certainly one of my favorite songs.
There we go. Thank you, Zachary, for your poem. And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners for joining us for this episode of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.